Hi, my name is Sarah Spike. I'm a settler, originally from Mi'kma'ki, from Nova Scotia in traditional Mi'kmaq territory. And today I'm reading from Chochoge, from the island of Montreal, in traditional Mohawk territory. I'm a historian and PhD candidate in history at Carleton University. And today I'm going to be reading a section of the TRC report entitled Sports, Inspiring Lives, Healthy Communities. And this is pages 297 to 300 of the TRC report. The Commission heard from survivors that the opportunity to play sports at residential school made their lives more bearable and gave them a sense of identity, accomplishment, and pride. At the Alberta National event, survivor Theodore Fontaine, Ted Fontaine, placed a bundle of mementos into the bentwood box as expressions of reconciliation. It included a pair of baseball pants that he had worn at residential school. He said, I quote, "These woolen baseball pants carry a story of their own. These are the baseball pants that I wore in 1957, 1958, as a 15-year-old incarcerated boy at the Fort Alexander Residential School. Little did I know that my mom would treasure and keep them as a memento of her youngest boy. When I leave this land, they won't have anywhere else to go, so I hope the bentwood box keeps them well. When we were little boys at Fort Alexander Residential School, our only chance to play hockey literally did save our lives. A lot of people here will attest to that. As a young man, playing hockey saved me, and later, playing with the Saging old-timers saved me again. I came back 15 years later, and started playing with an old-timers hockey team in Fort Alexander. In 1983, we ended up winning the first World Cup by an indigenous team in Munich, Germany. So I'm including in this bundle a story of the old-timers, a battalion of Anishinaabe hockey players who saved themselves and their friends by winning, not only winning in Munich, Germany, but in the 3 or 4 other hockey tournaments in Europe. People ask me, why don't you just enjoy life now instead of working so hard on reconciliation and talking about residential schools? What do you expect to achieve? The answer is freedom. I am free. That's the end of the quote. Later that same day, journalist Laura Robinson's expression of reconciliation was a copy of the documentary Frontrunners, which she produced for APTN, about some residential school athletes who had made history. She said, I quote, "In 1967, 10 teenage First Nation boys, all good students and great runners, ran with the 1967 Pan Am Games torch from St. Paul, Minnesota to Winnipeg, a distance of 800 kilometers, which they did successfully. But the young men who delivered that torch to the stadium were turned away at the door. They were not allowed to watch those games. They were not allowed to run that last 400 meters. One of them told me that he remembered being turned around and put back on the bus to residential school. In 1999, Winnipeg hosted the Pan Am Games again, and the organizers realized what had happened. They tracked down the original runners, apologized, and 32 years later, as men in their 50s, those runners finished that 400 meters and brought the torch in. Sport is a place that we speak a universal language, a language of shared passion for moving our bodies through time and space with strength and skill. This summer, in 2014, Regina will host the North American Indigenous Games. Let us all hope and commit to reconcile divisiveness, racism, and stereotype through the world of sport and support each other and support each and every young person attending those games, because they are the front runners of the future." That's the end of the quote. Such stories are indicative of the need for the rich history of Aboriginal people's contributions to sport to become part of Canadian sport history. On November 18th, 2014, we attended an event hosted by the Law Society of Upper Canada to celebrate the first time an Aboriginal community, the Mississaugas of New Credit First Nation. was to be the host First Nation for the Para-Pan American Games, held in Toronto in July and August of 2015. The frontrunners attended and were honored in a traditional blanketing ceremony. Now there are 2 calls to action here. Number 87, we call upon all levels of government, in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples, sports halls of fame, and other relevant organizations, to provide public education that tells the national story of Aboriginal athletes in history. And call to action 88, we call upon all levels of government to take action to ensure long-term Aboriginal athlete development and growth, and continued support for the North American Indigenous Games, including funding to host the Games and for provincial and territorial team preparation and travel. Aboriginal youth today face many barriers to leading active, healthy lives in their communities. They lack opportunities to pursue excellence in sports. There is little access to culturally relevant traditional sports activities that strengthen Aboriginal identity and instill a sense of pride and self-confidence. Lack of resources, sports facilities, and equipment limits their ability to play sports. Racism remains an issue. Aboriginal girls face the extra barrier of gender discrimination. Despite the many achievements of individual Indigenous athletes, too many Aboriginal youth remain excluded from community-based sports activities and the pursuit of excellence in sport. The Physical Activity and Sport Act of 2003 set out the federal government's sport policy regarding the full and fair participation of all Canadians in sport, and mandated the minister to, quote, facilitate the participation of underrepresented groups in the Canadian sports system, end quote. However, the Act made no specific reference to Aboriginal peoples. Call to action 89. We call upon the federal government to amend the Physical Activity and Sport Act to fully support reconciliation by ensuring that policies to promote physical activity as a fundamental element of health and well-being reduce barriers to sport participation, increase the pursuit of excellence in sport, and build capacity in the Canadian sports system are inclusive of Aboriginal peoples. In 2005, Sport Canada developed the Aboriginal Peoples Participation in Sports Policy, which recognized the unique circumstances of Aboriginal peoples and the role of sport as a vehicle for individual and community health and cultural revitalization. It recognized that Aboriginal peoples have their own culturally diverse, traditional knowledge and cultural teachings of play, games, and sports. However, no action plan was subsequently developed to implement the policy. In 2011, in preparation for revising the 2002 Canadian Sport Policy, Sport Canada conducted a series of consultations across the country, including a roundtable on sport and Aboriginal peoples. The roundtable summary report noted, I quote, participants believe that the needs and issues of Aboriginal peoples were not adequately reflected in the 2002 Canadian Sport Policy. The feeling among participants was that the previous policy had no teeth. The new Canadian Sport Policy should acknowledge the unique identity of Aboriginal peoples, what Aboriginal peoples can contribute to Canadian sport, and make a clear commitment to action. The Canadian Sport Policy can support sport for Aboriginal peoples by reflecting Aboriginal culture and realities, cross-cultural issues between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples, and an understanding of the motivation behind the interest of Aboriginal peoples in sport. If the new policy doesn't reflect the needs and issues of Aboriginal sport, then it will not be relevant to the Aboriginal population. It would be important to recognize It would be important to recognize that the barriers to sport extend beyond a lack of resources and gaps and weaknesses in the sports system. Aboriginal peoples are also affected by issues of identity and historical trauma. That's the end of the quote. Despite this roundtable report, based on the 2011 consultation, the Commission notes that the subsequent Canadian sport policy, released in 2012, contains no specific references to Aboriginal peoples. Call to action number 90. We call upon the federal government to ensure that national sports policies, programs, and initiatives are inclusive of Aboriginal peoples, including, but not limited to, establishing, and there are 4 points here. Number 1, in collaboration with provincial and territorial governments, stable funding for and access to community sports programs that reflect the diverse cultures and traditional sporting activities of Aboriginal peoples. Number 2, an elite athlete development program for Aboriginal athletes. Number 3, programs for coaches, trainers, and sports officials that are culturally relevant for Aboriginal peoples. And number 4, anti-racism awareness and training programs. The 2010 Winter Olympics in Vancouver, British Columbia, were held on the traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, Tsawwassen, and Lil'wat peoples, and they were an integral part of the event. In the spirit of reconciliation, which aligns easily with the spirit of the Games themselves, the 4 host First Nations and the Vancouver Olympic Committee formed a partnership that ensured that Indigenous peoples were full participants in the decision-making process, a first in Olympic history. At the opening ceremonies and throughout the Games, territorial protocols were respected, and the 4 host First Nations and other Indigenous peoples from across the province were a highly visible presence at various Olympic venues. Call to action number 91. We call upon the officials and host countries of international sporting events such as the Olympics, Pan Am, and Commonwealth Games to ensure that Indigenous peoples' territorial protocols are respected and local Indigenous communities are engaged in all aspects of planning and participating in such events. That's the end of my section. I'd like to thank Zoe Todd, Erica Violet Lee, and Joey Murdoch Flowers for creating this amazing project to read the TRC report. Thanks for listening.